I've been given 10 minutes to discuss something which is very, very complicated, so this will be a very brief statement, but as best as I can do. What I want to do is to try to do two things. One, I want to compare the economic situation, the financial crisis of the present, with the one that began in 1929 and went into the Great Crash. And the other thing I want to do is to relate all of this to the election in which we hope that Obama will win. So let me begin with the 1929 crash. Now, there was a great difference between then and now in terms of the financial sector. The stock market crash in 1929 was a stock market crash. So it was a crash of people who had bought stocks hoping they'd go up or hoping they would go up, and so on. These were middle-class people. Today's financial crash has to do with everyone, not just everyone in the United States, everyone in the world, because today there's globalization, and all the countries are connected with all the others. If you read today's paper, for example, you'd know that Iceland, little old Iceland, has had to shut its banks down and cut off its credit cards. People cannot use their credit card. Now nothing like that happened in 1929, and so on and so on. What did happen, however, and which is something like what's going to happen now, is that the economy, after the financial system cracked because of the stock market crash, what happened was it also began a very serious depression, which in the United States went on from 1929 until the second year of World War II, in 1942, when the United States got in there. But now this is going on in the middle of a couple of wars and so on, and there's a lot of other differences. Now, I'll take a personal note here. When 1929, when this started in the United States, I was 10 years old. 2 or 3 years later, in my family, which had no father, my mother was working as a teacher, and all teachers' salaries in San Francisco were cut by 50%, and they were already low to begin with. What this meant was that I had to go to work. So I had some working relationship as a kid with what was going on. And what happened was my mother's salary was cut by 50%, and then I went to work for what we call in the United States dirt wages, might be called shit wages, as a kid, as my brother did have to also. So I paid a lot of attention to that depression, and I've been paying a lot of attention to that sort of thing since this time. Another major thing is that the economy in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and until you get after World War II, the economy of the United States was dominated by industry. From 1940s on, it increasingly came to be dominated by finance, by banks, and by speculation. And that has made the whole situation much more precarious than it was before, and so on and so on. In 1929, when the crash took place, it was a big surprise to everyone, as what's happening now is a surprise. And I just want to quote, I'm an economist, but I have very little respect for economists because they don't pay much attention to reality. And the leading economist in 1928 in the United States was a man named Irving Fisher. And what he said in 1928 is worth repeating now, because the economists now are also not very accurate about what's going on. He said in 1928, the business cycle has settled on a high plateau of endless prosperity. Well, the depression didn't last for another didn't get over for another 10 years. It didn't get over, as I said a moment ago, until the middle of the first years of World War II. Now, another major difference is that when the financial crack hit in 1929, it also hit Germany, but it didn't go around the world. There was not globalization then. What was going on in the 20s and the 1930s in the rest of the world was fascism in Germany, fascism in Italy, fascism in Japan, and so on. But the world economy was disconnected rather than connected in that period. So what happens in the United States today is what happens there connects automatically with what's going on in the rest of the world. And that's a very, very big difference. Another big difference is this, and it's a very, very big difference which should be very worrisome for us today. In 1929, the years before 1929 and throughout the 1930s, the average person never, ever borrowed in order to buy. There was no such thing as credit cards, nothing like it. That is to say, you bought something. If you bought something, you paid cash for it. Now, as it happens, that didn't mean you'd pay for a house, but if you bought other things, you pay. And the consequence of that, or one of the things about that, was that the kinds of things that people bought were things that they needed more than anything else. I mean, very few. For example, we did not have an automobile in my family until the late 1930s. It was just simply not affordable, and you couldn't borrow to buy an automobile unless you were already well off, and a middle-class person. I say that no credit cards, and I pointed out about Iceland a moment ago. In Iceland, they've shut off the credit cards. And this is going to happen all over the world. And what we're talking about now is the probability not of there just being a financial crisis, but of there being a nationwide, worldwide economic crisis, which is more likely than not to go into not recession, which is already in, but depression. And it's very hard to see how we would get out of it, because the kind of people who are ruling the governments, whether you look at Britain or Canada or the United States or France or Italy or Germany, are all conservative governments. And they are not inclined in any sense to do the kinds of things that are essential and necessary to get us up out of a recession or a depression. And I'm going to talk about those things just before I quit. But let me just go now and say that when I say that things are going to get worse, I mean that, but I also mean that the kinds of things that are happening have created such fragile economies because of the financial aspect of it, that it's really impossible to predict just how much of an explosion is going to take place, or how deep the effects of it are going to be. What you can say is that what brought this financial crack up to happen was essentially based upon what they call derivatives. Now, I'm not going to try to explain derivatives here, but it's something that began to take hold in the 1980s and then exploded. When it started to take hold, the derivative groups that started it were started up by two economists, Nobel Prize economists, supposedly geniuses, who created the whole idea of a derivative, and they created a group called long-term capital something or other, LTCM, long-term capital management. And the idea was that very rich people could put a lot of money into something, and their investment would be scattered all around in the economy, all around different kinds of financial instruments, so that nothing could go wrong, because if something went wrong one place, it would be offset by something being okay in the other place. Now, these derivatives, at first, the derivative companies like LCTM were eligible. People who could be in those were people who had to have $1 million to invest, okay? No less. You had to put $1 million, you had to be very rich. And what happened was that LCTM went bankrupt, and the government stepped in and took care of it so that it could get back into business. And there were only 8 of these kinds of derivative companies in 1998 when this happened. Now there are 8,000 of them, and anybody can go into the derivatives market. That is to say, the percentage of the population that was involved in this very, very fragile kind of investment was way less than 1%. Now it's really well over half of the people. So we're talking about a much more precarious world than was going on in 1929 and the rest of the time.